Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining me on this third session of the DevOps pipeline. My name is Adam Anderson, and today I'm going to cover advanced development pipelines and see if we can't keep going on this great learning path that you've all been joining in this SQL Pass. Before I get started, I would like to highlight all that Pass has to offer. For me personally, it has been a life-changing experience, not only through the learning that I have received through all these great chapters and everything, but it's been a massive journey for me to begin presenting at these. And I would highly encourage anyone who is remotely interested to step up, join one of these local groups, your local user group, such as mine, which is SQL Sacramento. There's SQL Saturdays that you can volunteer for, virtual groups, and much, much more. So I highly recommend everyone get involved and help out with these local chapters. It only makes a community stronger, and it'll make you stronger. Also, please fill out session evaluations. I'm always trying to improve and get better at what I'm doing and help me provide better services and training for all of you. So again, please submit those before Friday, which is actually only 2-3 hours from now. A little introduction, my name is Adam Anderson, and I have been in IT since 1995, so a little over 25 years. Been doing databases for 14 years, I guess it says there. I am a Microsoft Certified Solution Associate and a Senior BI Developer. My contact information is on the slide there. Contact me through LinkedIn at Adam Anderson DBA or at SQL Pioneer on Twitter. Today's agenda, we're going to go through advanced DevOps pipelines, an introduction to it, what's changed recently. There's been some massive changes that I'm really excited about. We're also going to cover a big part of those changes, which is YAML pipelines. We're going to build a DAC pack. Then we're going to move on to deploying that DAC pack into a container inside Azure DevOps and running that container as a service within there. We're going to deploy that DAC pack into that container. Then we're going to go back to our first pipeline and work on the deployment of that code to an environment and see if we can't go into some environment automation and then summarize. So DevOps pipelines. DevOps pipelines used to be known as build and release. There was a separate section for build and a separate section for release on the website itself. So if I quickly jump over to the Azure pipelines, you'll see here under our pipelines, we have pipelines, environments, releases. This used to be called build. And now they've replaced that with pipelines. This only made general availability in the spring, somewhere in the March timeframe. And prior to that, I'd been using this. I had preferred this method over the old build method anyway, and mostly because it saves things as YAML files, which are versionable and checked in, specifically checked into version control. We'll get more into that later and what all that means, actually in just a slide or two. But first of all, I just want to cover some key Azure pipeline concepts so that hopefully you aren't too lost. I know you might have already seen some of this stuff, so I'm going to go quickly and get into it. But the main highlight that a lot of people don't go into is pipelines contain stages, which contain jobs, which contain steps. Jobs can also be split up into a build job and a deployment job, which we will get into. But so there's layers of how this stuff works. Like I said, pipelines contain stages. Now, if you look in that middle section where the jobs are inside of an agent box right here. And what that means is you can either use an agent on Microsoft's hosted platform, or you can install an agent on your local machine as well and do those builds locally. They all require an agent with the exception of a job that invokes a REST API call. Those are the only type of build that don't require an agent, but we will go into that quite a lot. We will also cover jobs depending on other jobs, pipelines depending on other pipelines, how various steps and scripts are working. And we will also, shifting all the way back to the left in the beginning, go over some triggers, which you can really set up some advanced orchestrations and flows through pipelines and triggers through various methods, which we will definitely get into. So what are pipelines? Pipelines contain these four major categories: resources, variables, triggers, and stages. Resources are various things that the pipeline uses, such as pipelines, other pipelines that is, containers, and code repositories. The main thing being code repositories is by far the most common, as you'd expect. Variables are another component at the pipeline level. Variables also exist in stages and jobs, and we'll get into the hierarchy of how variables work. But variables, for the most part, have names, they have values. There are also groups of variables that you can bring in one group, and it might contain many variables that are predefined for you to use. Triggers can be comprised of push triggers, pull triggers, schedules that run on a specific cron time scale, which can get kind of confusing because that's actually Greenwich Mean Time. And where I'm at in California, daylight savings time, you got to know the time of the year, and you got to make sure those things are triggering at the right times. And then finally, triggers can also be based off of other pipelines. And the push and pull are related to the code repositories if you're pushing or pulling certain pipelines there. And then finally, stages. The stages are where the actual work gets done. And in stages, you reference pools. You can also reference what they call a depend on. So one stage can depend on another stage. Conditions. This stage only runs if this other stage passes or fails. If a stage fails, maybe you want this other stage to trigger. So you can get pretty advanced in those conditions. Variables are, like I mentioned, can also be at the stage level, and those take precedence over the variables at the pipeline level. And then we'll get into jobs itself, which can be jobs, templates, all sorts of different things. Now, there are more categories under each one of these, but these are the main ones that I wanted to get into. So digging a little bit deeper under stages, remember we have jobs. These are some of the conditions, and again, there are more of these conditions than what I'm showing here, but you can have a job depend on another job. There's conditions that can be here. Strategies is something we're going to get into pretty deep in the second demo here, and but it essentially can allow you to run the same, you can run the same job steps multiple times all simultaneously. So it's really, really a cool feature. Then there's pools and containers. Now a pool is the virtual machine that we're working in, that your pipeline is running in. Most people think it is a container, and while I don't believe that, I don't know for sure, but The reason I don't believe that is because you can have a pool, a VM image is what you're defining. Then you can run a container in the job. So then your build actually runs inside the container. So you can have your build run in a container, but by default, it's just running in a VM. You can also define other pool types. Then again, we have variables, steps, and services, which we will be using. In this case, we'll use a service to run our container in this second demo. So getting into variables a little bit, because these are very, very, very important to pipelines. There are three types of variables, three main types, categories: user-defined variables, predefined variables, and groups of variables, as I mentioned. User-defined variables have many different types. I just listed three of them right there: strings, numbers, and booleans. Variables can also be any type of YAML object, from a job to a stage to anything else in there. It's a long list of variable options. Predefined variables are system variables, agent variables, builds, pipelines, and deployments. And those are there to help you be able to reference and find things within your jobs, because everything is relative to one of those predefined variables. If you want to find where your code was downloaded to so that it can be built properly, you're going to most likely need to find the agent build path or something to that effect, usually referencing agent. If you want to get the build number, you would go under build.build ID or build number. There are a lot of different variables there that you can use. And then, of course, groups. I have that under library because specifically when I switch over to our thing, we do have a library here, and we can set up a variable group in here. And that variable group contains other variables, like in this case, username and password. So I can reference this dev library group within my YAML pipeline if I choose to do that. So variable syntax gets a little confusing. And when I first saw it, I thought, well, the macro one, that's super easy, right? It's $, open paren, variable, close paren. That's the one I'm going to use. So I just use that everywhere. Well, it took me a month or two before I started running into scenarios where that didn't work. And it took me a little while to figure out that the variable wasn't being populated when I needed it to be. So I dug into this a little bit more, and you can see the when column there tells you when that variable's values are actually populated. So macro is only populated at runtime before the task executes. Run expressions are done as it's executing. And the one that's done first is actually at compile time, which is the template expression. So for example, I needed to use a variable for my stage names. So in order for me to do that, that had to be done at compile time. So when I was using the macro syntax, it didn't work. There was no value inside that variable at compile time. So I had to switch over to the template syntax, and then the value was already there when I clicked the run button to run that. So then I could list out the different stages and the stage names, and everything worked okay. So you're going to really have to keep an eye on that syntax. And when in doubt, I personally nowadays just use a template syntax expression, but you really should pay attention to when you're going to use that, what time would work best. Moving into basic YAML pipelines, this is YAML. This is what we're looking at right here. This is a basic pipeline. No other code is needed, so it can be very simple. Trigger, technically trigger isn't even necessary if you want to manually kick these pipelines off, but what that means is if you check in code and you do a pull request into master, then this pipeline will automatically trigger and execute at that time during a pull request into master after it's been merged. Pool, like I mentioned there is a VM image. There's Windows latest and Ubuntu latest, and then there's older versions of both of those. So you could do Windows 2016. You could do Ubuntu, whatever it is, 14.2 or whatever the numbers are there. And then you go into steps and then tasks. Now notice in this particular one, and I'm going to go to the next slide here because it illustrates what I'm showing, there are optional things that I did not include in that last one. Stages, with the stage and the name, jobs, job and the job name, are optional if there's only one stage and one job. If you have more than one stage, then they are both required. If you have one stage but two jobs, stage is still optional, but jobs is no longer optional. So you have to work through that. And then everything under job, steps, tasks, things are required. Now there is a little syntactical problem here as I didn't tab in to align with the job there, but you'll see that in many other areas. This is more just for readability. Alternative formatting for different tasks. What I mean by this is task, I'm running this very similar task here. All three of these are PowerShell, and they all do very similar things. But you notice the first hyphen right up here, task inputs script, is very explicit. There's a lot of code there, right? PowerShell at 2. That does not mean version 2 of PowerShell. That means version 2 of the PowerShell task that they have here. This is a much later version of PowerShell. I think it's the latest version, but I'm not positive what version. It would actually change depending on which VM image you're using. And then your task itself, the PowerShell that you want to execute, would be under script in this location, the get child item. So the next one down right here, PowerShell, is a shortcut. Shortcut PowerShell : get child item. That's the alias for get child item is GCI. Environment variable : variable. So $env : variable will give you the environment variable printed out for that variable. PowerShell, same, the PWSH is just a shortcut, but it also executes a different version of PowerShell that is PowerShell core. So you can choose PowerShell versus PowerShell core depending on which shortcut you're using, which alias you're using there. And then on the right-hand side, because I was going into PowerShell, I did want to show, this is called, on the left, it's called inline PowerShell scripting. On the right, it's a file path. So notice there I have inputs. Target type is file path. That target type is not required if it's an inline script, but it is required if it's a file path. So I put that in, then I put a file path, but notice I'm using a variable reference there, and I just noticed a typo on this slide, so please forgive me. Variable.path is not required there. It would just be $brackets path. So this is a little bit of pseudocode there. And then arguments, but do notice that file path and arguments are slightly different there. So you're going to create a path to the script, but if you have arguments to go into it, you do not put that in the file path. Those go in a separate argument, and that gets passed in after it. So I did want to include these references. Please feel free to go to my GitHub page, which is SQL Pioneer at GitHub, and you can download this entire script and everything. I will show you that more in a minute, but please feel free. These are the references. I did include references on the other slides, but these are a little bit of extra. And notice they are all Microsoft documentation. I actually learned everything that I'm showing you here today through these Microsoft documentation pages and then experience. So there is no training on this stuff yet that I have seen. So now we're going to get into a quick build pipeline. I'm going to go into that and we will move forward. But first, here's my GitHub repo. And specifically, this one is in that URL at the top, github.com/SQLpioneer/advanced ADL pipelines. Everything is available in here. The PowerPoint presentation as well as all the code, and this is a live repo. I will be modifying it and continually evolving this for future presentations. So let's go back to, this is again, that same repo. Well, one thing you can notice here, if I go back, I'm at that top level. I've been working in here, I pushed things recently. I can also go, notice it's kind of inconspicuous, but there's a little check mark here. If I click this check mark, we can see everything that has run and if it succeeded or not. So this tells me the status of my code builds that I have set up. So this is a really, really advanced pipelines technique. There's actually GitHub takes the Git repositories that are in Azure DevOps. So there's repos in Azure DevOps, and these are just Git repos. GitHub actually adds a lot more functionality to what can be done, what is possible. That's not what this presentation is about, so I'm not going to be getting into that too much, but just know there are new actions that can be taken place. There are what's the new one that they just added? It's code spaces. So you can use GitHub code spaces to actually do your development work for Visual Studio on, say, a thin client computer. So it's really, really cool. I highly recommend you check out some of those videos that describe that stuff better. It's really, really fun. So here's my GitHub repo. I'm going to be in this one basic demo right here. Now notice I do have 3 different folders, 1 basic, 2 container, 3 Docker is still under construction. It's not quite working yet. So the 2 demos that I'm working on here are 1 basic and 2 container. This 3 Docker is going to eventually run tests inside the Docker container that I am using here. But that is not working quite yet. I still need to do a little bit more with .NET Core and getting that to run in containers for testing. But here under 1 basic, I have a pipeline solution right here. I could open this up, but this is just a standard DAC pack build in Visual Studio. Not a whole lot special in here. I will open it up real quick and just show you. But for the most part, it's exactly what you would expect. So while that's opening, I'm going to go over here to pipelines. And my first pipeline is this one at the bottom, 1 basic. So I'm going to click on that. And one of the things that I do want to actually call out even before I go into there is these are deceptively simple, and they have a lot of different links on here. Now notice where my highlighter is on this screen. And actually I'm going to zoom in just a little bit, make this bigger on your screens. So notice the whole line here, gray, then just these words show up gray, and then down here, container shows up highlighted. So these are actually 3 different links, not this. That that is a different link. And then over here is another link I can add to my favorites, and then I have more links in there. So there's actually a lot here. I can also go to all for all recent pipelines and various runs, and it will just show all of the runs that have been happening on this computer. So there's a lot going on this page, and depending on if I click on this line versus right here, which will take me to, this one takes me to a job, or to the pipeline itself. This one takes me to a job step, and then this one takes me to the code that was actually used for this run. So I'm going to click on the pipeline link, and you can see now there's a whole bunch of jobs that ran in here. Now, I've been testing, so this is, you can see I don't have a real good rate right now, but I've been writing a lot of stuff. So I'm going to forgive that a little bit right now. And frankly, as a DevOps engineer at my job every day, I get a lot of that where it's not actually working quite right. And I do a lot of iterations and a lot of running. So I see that box in the corner a lot. And I really wish I could just get rid of it, but not that I've found so far. So here at this pipeline level, notice here at the top, this is our breadcrumbs, and I'm in my conference demos project. I'm in the pipelines area, and then I'm within this particular pipeline called SQL Demo Container 2. Now, I meant to actually go into the other pipeline, basic 1, my bad. I'm glad I looked, there we go. So now you'll see this one actually have 2 stages over here, 2 different check marks. And if one of these was waiting to run, it would actually show up as a spinning circle that is open to run. Now we have the same links here. Now notice this one has the master branch, and then this one here has the exact code. Master will be whatever's in master now. Even if I went down here, it would be to the container branch, whatever's in container. If I scroll down here even more, this master is the same as the master up top, but this link right here, 54362C2, is completely different than this link. So it gets confusing. I see people all the time kind of get confused with that a little bit. So I just wanted to make sure you were aware of it. So I'm actually going to go in. I'm going to do this in 2 different ways. First of all, I'm going to open another window with this exact job step. Then I'm going to pull this off to the side so that we can see that code right here on one side. And in this side, I'm going to move that over, and we're going to look at the code that's executing it on this side. So when we're looking here, I do have some various triggers. I will come back to this, but I wanted to highlight while we're in this mode, here's job, build job. There's build job. Here's like we're checking out code. Here's a NuGet tool installer, NuGet communication, directory list. We can go down here. Here's our directory list. Here's our NuGet. So you can really see VS build, VS build. So these are the side by side. This is what the YAML descriptive language looks like. And on the right-hand side is what actually ran. So in this particular case, directory list, if I go back up just a little bit to directory list, we can see I just ran a PowerShell command of dir-s. That on this side actually gives me a list of all the files in that container. So this, I find, is by far the best troubleshooting I can get. I'm often trying to figure out, oftentimes, like every time I'm doing this, where is this code being downloaded to? Where is it being built in? Like, what's the path that's being built in? And where am I to execute certain tools in there? Maybe I'll just get better at that over time, but it's been 9 months and I haven't gotten better at it. So I still do this directory listing command all the time right here. I do that a lot. There's a number of commands that I highly recommend you take a look at in here for troubleshooting purpose. NuGets, for those who don't know, I'm not going to get into it much, but NuGets are a way of packaging up code and installing it. So this is installing the NuGet installer and then installing our solution, which notice here is in a variable. So we have the macro syntax for the variable pulling in the solution right here, one basic pipeline solution. I do have the other variables right up here. Now this is very, very similar to what happened when I clicked create a basic pipeline. I'm not going to go into that part. I suspect since this is part of the learning path, you've already seen that. So notice here I have stages. I have a build stage. I have my VM image of Windows latest. Then I'm declaring my job and my various steps. Right in here I have my PowerShell, my VS build, and in here I believe, technically speaking, I don't even need this line. I have had it run with and without that line because I'm not sending in anything that's earth-shattering. I've also done this where I ran a build of only one project, even though the solution contained two. So that is possible. The example of that is out in my GitHub repo under AdventureWorks. There's an AdventureWorks repository where I have testing, where I'm working on my testing solution. And that one, I'm doing different builds of different databases in there. But keeping going down here, we have PowerShell, I have my directory list. Here's getting, now notice this one here, I said, go into the build source directory, basic one, give me a directory listing of that, versus up here is just I'm getting a directory listing. So if we take the difference, a look at the difference here, this first one is just going in the S directory. So this is where it always installs, A1S. Now if I go down here to directory path basic, here it's A1S 1 basic. So really these two variables, this this build source directory is the same thing as /s. But I wanted to show you how you get these various build directories. Now, in this particular one, we do our build. It creates our DAC pack, and it's going to create it in this location right here. One basic school bin release. Now, if I flip over to here, one basic pipelines project, actually, one basic school project. There's school project. All right, now we're getting closer. There's bin, there's release, and there's our DAC pack. So that's the way that I found this. So now over here, I go into my build directory, there's my path, and I'm saving that as an artifact named school project DB, and I'm publishing it to, they're calling it a container. It's really the location in which you're saving this. And then I'm also doing that same thing, but this one here does include tests, and there is a test container there, or a test project that can run, and I'm saving that for later use. I could run that in my container, I could run that on my local laptop, wherever I choose to do that. And then notice here I'm moving into a different stage, and I'm going to come back to this in my third demo. So this is kind of this is a good moving point to go back to our PowerPoint. Oops. Oh, before I do that, I want to go into, here's our solution. You can see it is just, here's a school project for tests, and here's the DAC pack, and there's only a couple of tables in this particular build. It's nothing that earth-shattering and going on there. So let me switch back to to my PowerPoint. And this next one is, it took the most time for me to set up for this entire presentation. And that is because using containers in pipelines, I found to be very challenging. It's something that's been a goal of mine for a long time, so I'm glad I put in the effort to figure it out. But I'll be perfectly honest, it's hard. It's hard. I'm familiar with Docker. I've run other demos on my laptop with Docker running locally. It is completely different running it in a pipeline. The basics I learned running it locally were extremely important to me to run it in this pipeline. So where I set that up, and I'll go into the little nuances, but I just wanted to call that out, that this is not easy. And if you have to know Docker, learn Docker first, do a basic build, run a pipeline, get that stuff working before you try doing this in a container would be my recommendation. Now, getting into this VM. So we are running this build on a virtual machine. We called it VM image, right? So you choose to run Ubuntu latest or Windows latest, depending on if you want to run a Linux container or a Windows container. I've tried several times. Somebody told me I could run a Linux container on the Windows latest VM. I've not gotten it to work. Every time it tells me this container is not compatible with this virtual machine. So I'm just going to say you can only run Linux containers on a Linux VM and Windows on a Windows VM. If you're running this on a personal build agent, that's not the case. So depends on your setup and what you want to do. This is your limitations that we have. So the container architecture in Azure. Now this is specific to Azure. We have our VM image on both sides. Notice in the first one, we're running MS SQL as a service, and I have to expose my port 1433. Because I'm in a VM, I'm connecting into a service, I have to go through the port. If I'm running a VM image and I specify a container for that job, and then my container I'm calling my build. Now, if I'm running a service called MySQL, I'm not going through a port because my build is inside the container, and that container is already networked to the other container, and you don't need to expose those ports. So that's a little nuance in the architecture that is well documented, and one of the reasons that I set up my builds the way I did, and you'll see that in just a moment. Now it's time to get into the strategy a little bit. So this is really interesting and very powerful. You define a strategy and the matrix, and I don't think there's really any other options other than the matrix here under strategy. But one of the things I wanted to call out is here, I'm calling a SQL 2017 and a SQL 2019 containers. I'm running both of them as a service, and then this hierarchy is just to show what the YAML pipeline looks like. So you can see here, container MS SQL 2017. The image that I'm using here is a Ubuntu 2017 latest. This is the exact same code that you'll see in a minute for 2019. I just wanted to make it bigger on the screen so you could read it easily enough. And I'm just keeping the image name. And I am keeping my container name the same, which you'll see on the next slide, more for convenience than necessity, but that's just my choice. But up here under resources, where I'm defining this container, I'm also defining the port that I'm using. That's what I was referring to earlier. If I'm running a container as my build agent, then I don't need to declare the port here. I can declare the port in different places. So there is a little bit of flexibility in where you create these things, but you do still have to declare the port that you're going to use. And of course, SQL Server runs on port 1433 by default. There are environment variables that I'm passing into this particular container as it's running. I'm accepting the license agreement. I have a password declared and secured, so that is being passed in. I'm using the Express Edition, and I'm setting a name for this container of MS SQL 2017. When I go down, this is where I'm actually using it. Now notice here I have strategy, matrix, and then I'm declaring SQL Server 2017, MS SQL Service. So here I have 2017 and 2019. They're different. MS SQL Service, I have the same. And then I'm using that same name inside here. The reason I point that out is down here under this variable, I'm saying variable MS SQL Service. That's referring to this variable right here. This is considered a variable. And it's referencing, it's going to put this value in service. So it's really referring to this as a hierarchy and how that is running. Let me switch over, and I think this will make a little bit more sense if we're actually looking at the container service itself. So notice I'm looking at my breadcrumbs up here. I'm going to go back to pipelines level. So this is a fast way of navigating around. And I'm going to go into this demo2 container. So this container here, I'm going to go into the edit. Now this one only has one stage, but if I go into edit here, this is the actual code, and as that's loading, I'm going to do the same thing here to get us ready so we can actually see what's going on, but that'll take a moment to load. So in here, we have our resources, our containers. Here's container 1, container 2, I have my ports. And then I am actually, in this one, I am referencing a pipeline as a resource as well. Now, this is the one basic pipeline that I'm reusing. Now, remember, at the end of that pipeline, when it was done, actually, I never showed you this part. When it was actually done with this run, oops, it has 2 artifacts that are published at the end of it. It has our DAC pack, and it has the tests that I created that we're not using right now. But both of these are here, and here's our DAC pack. So in this container registry, we can see I'm referencing that pipeline, which makes those artifacts available to me in this container run. So that's how I'm getting my DAC pack into this container, into this build. Now, one thing that I didn't really go into too much in the last one is this trigger. I am triggering this based off of one folder versus another folder. And in this one, I'm saying, if I make a change to this folder, trigger my build. But if I make a change to the one basic folder, don't trigger my build. Ignore it. Don't do this one. Now, there is I switched over to a different branch. And in this one, I actually have a trigger based off my pipeline. So when this one runs, it triggers when I go into, when it goes and merges into the master branch for this pipeline, it will automatically trigger this build as well after that other build is done. So you can really get quite fancy and with these various builds. Here's our triggers, I showed you that. Here's my variables. I have various variables declared for use later, and you can look at those. Here's my strategy, deploy to container, deploy to container. Here's my matrix. This is exactly what I showed you on that other slide. Running on Ubuntu latest, here's my matrix. Here's that declaration of a service. And notice I am not running as a container. I'm running as a service in the sidecar. I have not been able to get to run inside of the Linux SQL Server container. I was not able to do my build inside that container. So I've just been doing it as a service on the side, but it still works just as well. Now here I am downloading the basic, the download here. I am running install SQL pack. This is code that I've found on how to do this. Most of this stuff I didn't make up. I actually downloaded from various sources, and I tried to link to those sources wherever possible. Like, no, I think I have a link to that one in this code. If not, I'll make sure it's in the GitHub repo where I found it. But for the most part, it's just wget, which does the install of the SQL package. This is used to install the DAC pack, to deploy that DAC pack to SQL Server is what I'm doing here. I'm installing those tools. I am doing get environment variables, list my Docker images, and then show a Docker log. Then I'm going to sleep for 60 seconds. You might be able to get by with 10 seconds, 30 seconds. 60 is very safe. If you're not in a hurry, just set it to a little bit longer period, because sometimes SQL Server takes a little bit to start in these containers. The container starts and it says it's available. You can access the operating system, but SQL services are not necessarily started and ready to connect yet. So I do have a sleep timer in there. Then I'm also running, let's see. So then the next one, I am running a SQL command against localhost, master database, putting in my password, and I'm just getting the version. And then finally, I'm deploying my DAC pack right here. And then I'm doing the same query again, but this time I'm also getting the database name, and I'm connecting to my database that I just deployed as a DAC pack. So let's switch over to here. So this is the actual job run that happened. Now notice I have two jobs here, SQL Server 2017 and 2019. But if I switch back over here, there's only one job defined. I have my steps right here, or I have my jobs. There's one job. But this line right here is what forces it to do two different jobs. Notice deploy DAC pack in container. Deploy DAC pack in container. That's the same words. That's exactly what's happening. And then the service is getting populated at the end of that. So you can see how that is just adding it on. It's running both of them simultaneously. So they run in parallel here. I'm going to go into 2017. They are identical, and we can see them both right here at the same time. I am going to make this a little bit wider, getting rid of that. So here's our 2017. It initializes our container. It's running, and you can scroll through all the various logs, downloading artifacts, what it's been doing. Here's another download artifact. Here's installed packages. So this is where it installed that SQL package. We have our environment variables. Now I do want you to note here, we have agent, disable plugin, blah, blah. You know, here's our various environment variables that are available. Agent service MS SQL ports 1433 equals 1433. So it is available what port we're running on as a variable. This is what I was talking about with the predefined variables. We have agent underscore. That would be the same thing as $ agent dot job status. But if you're running in PowerShell, you specify $ environment agent underscore job status, environment : agent underscore job status, and that will give you succeeded, failed, you know, whatever the variable value is. And notice we switched over from agent. We have Azure, we have build. So there's a lot of different variables in here. And sometimes it's just really, really helpful to go in and look at what these variables are. If I want the pipeline name, if I want the run, because sometimes I'm naming my files based off of the run. So I can get that information right out of these environment variables. I use them all the time. I am doing a list Docker image. So here you can see we have MS SQL Server 2017. It's showing the container, the various things. I do have logs here, and we can scroll through the logs for SQL Server. This is our sleep, just doing a directory listening and sleeping. I'm connecting to SQL Server, and here is our version that I'm running in this one. If I scroll down here to 2019 and I do that same connect to SQL Server, we can see this one is 2019. So it's really neat to see that it's doing both of them. 2017, 2019, same run in a DAC pack. Here I'm publishing that DAC pack. It's deploying and creating my tables in that school database. And then finally, I'm connecting to that school database and I'm getting my server name and my database. So that is how you run a container inside of a service in Azure pipelines. Let me switch back. This is what we're doing. It's the matrix. You set up the service. If I only had one, if I was only running one container here, I would just take SQL Server 2017 and I would just replace this right here. It would just be that. So not a big deal. I'm doing those things right up here. So you can see once you learn how to do it, it's actually not too bad. You guys can copy and paste this and use the same techniques. The tricky part is now you're running in Linux. So if you're great with Linux, you're good, right? You know what you're doing, you're installing the software, you're running inside of a Linux container that doesn't have what you need by necessary. So you might have to create your own Docker image, save it in, say, either Docker Hub or Azure Container Registry. Then when I'm referencing your container up here, you'd reference your own container registry and download your container. So if, for example, you wanted to do your testing, but you required all of your databases to exist. Maybe you got 5 databases that are all tightly linked together. You'd create your Docker image. You would create that image with all 5 of your databases in the image. Upload that to Azure Container Registry. Now you're downloading that container right here. You deploy your DAC pack over top of the database that you're testing. Now you can run your tests and you have all 5 databases in a container and you can run all the tests that you want right there in Azure DevOps. You can also do all this against a local build agent, which you can define under your project settings. There are agent pools that you can define in here between Azure. I do not have any local build agent, but if I wanted to add a build agent, I can simply add a self-hosted agent and it will allow me to download the code that I want. So if I have self-hosted and I do Atom, move this, create. So now I have Atom. I can go into here and say a new agent and it will give me the code necessary to deploy that agent. All I have to do, download, copy this clipboard or to the clipboard, and it's done. Actually, and I don't even need to download the agent. A lot of times this will actually include a download for me. So creating these self-hosted agents isn't too hard, and sometimes it's easier to have that, sometimes it's not. So just keep that in mind. The next area that we're going into, and I am running a little short on time, but is environments. So I'm going to switch back to the PowerPoint real quick, and we're going to go into various environments. And if you haven't noticed, I'm into running, at least I was. I'm a little not doing as well as I was, but so these are me and two of my other friends that were running. This was a half marathon here, and we've done several marathons together and such. So it's a really good group, a really, really fun thing. So that's what those pictures have been that you've seen here. So environment automation. When we're working here, we can create environments for Azure SQL DB, app services, we can use Kubernetes, and we can do virtual machines both on-prem and in the cloud. So that is where I was looking at here for environments. Those are our various options that we can set up for environments. And I will be getting back to that demo, but we can run on a number of different types of systems. What this really comes down to, though, is when we're doing a deployment job, it changes to require an environment. So that environment I just showed you, that is a required feature. You don't need an agent on it necessarily. It gets complicated, but if you don't have, let me go back over here because it's easier to explain. In here, I'm in my Dev1 environment. I do have an agent on my laptop. If I didn't, it would use the agent that I was showing you down here under project settings. And it would deploy using that agent. So whether that's in Azure or whether that's on-prem, it would use that agent. But because I have an environment agent set up, it will use this agent instead. So there are technically 3 different types of agents. They're all the same exact agent, but depending on the parameters you install it with, depends on what type of agent I'm referring to. There is, excuse me, a deployment group, which contains a type of agent that is used by release. There is what I'm calling a build agent, and that was what was down here under our project settings for agent pools. So we have our agent pool here. We have a deployment group that contains agents, and then we have environment agents as well. So don't get those confused too much because, well, they can be confusing, but they're not all created equal. Additionally, however you're running this agent, if you're planning on using Windows security, you would install that agent and then it installs as a service. So then you just set that service to start as a particular Active Directory user account. Now I can just use Windows authentication to log into my SQL servers and run all of my SQL deployments using that. But let's get back here into deployment strategy. There's 3 different types of deployment strategies. Really quickly, there's run once, rolling, and canary. Run once runs all the deploys same time. I have an environment set up for all of my SQL servers that exist in my company. It runs all of them. I deployed PowerShell module, a PowerShell module to all of those servers. It was somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 deployments, all at the same time. They happened in 30 seconds. Really fast, really, really, really powerful. However, a little dangerous too, right? I had already tested it. I knew it worked. I was good. However, if I'm deploying a database, I'm not doing that. I might use a rolling deployment. I might use a canary deployment. And these are mostly referring to if it's a VM you're deploying to, or is it Kubernetes? That's the real difference between those 2 deployments. There are some other differences there. This one here will deploy a certain percentage or a certain number each time, wait for it to finish. You can have a health check. When the health check is complete, then it goes on. Or the canary is very similar, but it can ramp up and get bigger numbers. You could do 2 deploys, then do 5 deploys, then do 15 deploys. with a canary, and with rolling, you just have one set. The environment setup, I did already cover this, but I didn't cover, there's a whole bunch of checks you can do to prevent, to check before it deploys to an environment. So the most common one that I use a lot is approvals. So we set up various stages of our pipeline. A stage deploys to an environment, but then the environment is where I put the approver. So before we go to our QA environment, our teams wanted to have the ability to say yes or no, we can deploy to that environment as a person clicking the button to do that. So we use that deploy. I could use branch controls. I can use business hours, in other words, outside of business hours to deploy. I can evaluate targets. There's a lot of stuff to get into there. I do not have time to get into it. This is what the deployments look like. I'm using, so I have stage. Notice I have jobs, but instead of the word job here, it's actually deployment. Then my name, I have my display name that actually displays. Then I hear my environment, I have name dev1. So notice dev1 is what I was looking at before, and it is a virtual machine. If you do not include resource type virtual machine, it will not use that resource and it will not deploy to it. It will just keep using the agent that is in the other build pool. The strategy that I'm using is run once. So this is what that syntax looks like. And that's it. That's all there is to it. So if I do a quick switch over here to this pipeline, I'm going to go back to one basic, and I'm going to go into edit, and you'll see that we have that same code down here. I have my deployment job, my environment, here's my strategy, my steps. I do have this DAC pack. In this particular case, I have this one not running this step. That's how I rem that out. But this is the actual deployment of that DAC pack to my local laptop into the local host that I have here. Now this happens to be running in a Docker container on my laptop. So it is kind of funny. I am deploying to a Docker container even though I'm running it locally. And here I have my SQL Server authentication with that password. Now the one thing I didn't notice before or didn't note before is I do have my password under variables and it is changeable at runtime. I do have let users override this. And you can see within here, it shows you some of the syntax that you can use. If I'm in a PowerShell script, it shows you that syntax. So, and then that looks, when you're in here, it looks like it shows our various stages that I had defined. I can go in here to the second stage. Here's our build stage, here's our deploy stage, and it downloads the artifacts, runs the PowerShell that I had there, and then deploys the DAC pack. So that's my environment automation portion here. And thank you all for joining me today. Again, my name is Adam Anderson. And there we go. My name is Adam Anderson. And please contact me at SQL Pioneer on Twitter, my LinkedIn there. And remember, it's the same SQL Pioneer at GitHub. So I should be available online to answer any of your questions after this recording stops. So thank you all very much and enjoy the rest of your pass.